Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to get right down to it since we have such a short time and we've got quite a bit to cover. So, this session is specifically about open source software and procurement. And what I mean by that is situations where you are looking to license software from a vendor. And maybe you're doing that in terms of getting a consultant to write custom code for you, or you are trying to get some off the shelf code. But in any case, it's software that you want to use either in your products or services or something that you want to use internally. So, how do you think about acquiring software from third parties, and what kind of open source issues come up in that context? Um, okay, so do you even need open source specific provisions? So the reason I want to start with this is because in a lot of cases you really may not. If you have warranties and you've got indemnities in your contract that you're happy with respect to IP infringement, in many cases that's going to be more than enough to cover the liability sort of aspect of the contract. If that's going to cover, your risk with respect to copyright infringement, patent infringement, and any other kind of IP risks that you have defined. And in many cases, that's going to be sufficient. You really don't necessarily need to think about any other open source specific provisions because the IP infringement provisions in your warranties or indemnities will cover what you're doing. And you don't really need to think about your risk tolerance with respect to these things in a separate way than you do for IP issues generally. One reason I say that, for example, is because, if you have a big, broad indemnity from the vendor for patent infringement, for example, that's going to cover you for patent infringement, both in the software that they themselves wrote and in the software, or any third-party software that they include within what they have written. So you're really quite covered from a liability perspective. I would just make sure that people can be a little bit tricky about how they define vendor software. Sometimes they can phrase it in a way that might exclude third-party code that they include. So I would just, double check your definitions, make sure that it's nice and broad enough to really cover everything you're being handed. And the other thing is to really make sure that the scope of the license you're receiving covers everything you want to do now and everything you might want to do in the future. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times, the way that people write their, IP infringement warranties or indemnities kind of has to do with, they phrase it in a way of, you have the rights to give us everything that you have agreed to in this agreement and like in the license provisions. It's often framed that way. And so if, for example, like the vendor didn't give you a right to distribute the vendor software, you're going to have a very hard time getting any sort of IP related liability protection from them if you do distribute it, right? So just keep that in mind. But I think those are general good practices for drafting contracts. There's nothing new or weird here with respect to open source. Okay, so when do you need open source specific provisions? Okay, so I would say that you need these provisions for two reasons. One of which is that you have operational concerns unrelated to liability. So, for example, you might care a lot about process. You might care a lot about format. You might care a lot about, for example, like your audit requirements. Like maybe you're undergoing a third-party audit. You have like customer-specific sort of requirements that are coming at you from your customers, your partners, or something like that. And your concerns about open source like have much more to do about how things are done and making sure that things like fit within your process and that they work with your supply chain and all this other stuff. And that's sort of unrelated to liability, right? Or it's sort of situations where the liability aspect of it just kind of doesn't really matter for you. You know, Sometimes we're dealing with other sophisticated companies and sort of we trust that they know what we're talking about and they sort of understand what IP infringement means in an open source context. But in practice, a lot of the time we're working with really small companies that may not have an in-house counsel, may not understand anything about open source law, right? Or what it means when you say, hey, we need you to comply with the open source licenses. And so in cases like that, you're really writing these provisions to make sure that people are doing what you need them to do, and you are writing them more in order to provide operational guidance than in order to shift risk. Um, so sort of in the same way that sometimes you get really specific with your export provision clauses, or or you get very specific about, for example, like, what does it mean to like not offer people bribes, or not offer people, not do corrupt things. Sometimes you get very specific because you're trying to communicate what it is you actually want them to do, and you know that they're unsophisticated, and you know that if you don't spell it out, they may not do what you need them to do. So I think in particular, this comes up when the software that you're procuring is software that you specifically want to include in your products or services. That is where you really care a lot, because there may be certain open source licenses that are incompatible with the way that you license your own products or services. If you have commercial code, you may not want very strong copyleft code in there, because it may prohibit you from really making a business model that way. And there's situations, for example, like, let's say you might have an open source product yourself, right, under MIT or Apache and stuff like that. And there's a whole list of licenses that just aren't compatible with Apache, and you don't want to receive them. So that is really the context that I see this come up in the most. Where I will say you can just relax and move on is, if you're licensing purely internal software, right? You're trying to license something for like HR management, accounting, facilities, stuff like that, right? Generally that sort of stuff is stuff that you're licensing for internal use only, and it's really not going to be a part of any products or services you offer. And so long as that's the case, I wouldn't really worry about open source specific provisions. I think general IP warranties and indemnities are going to cover you in that scenario. So let's see. Yeah, I think we've covered most of the things on this slide. And one thing I would say is that I provided a little bit of guidance here. We're going to talk about we've talked about the sophistication of the vendor, but there's also the sophistication of you, the company, the purchaser. And as as you go up and down the sophistication spectrum, that will also affect how much you ask for and what kind of information you want to receive. And obviously, if you have an open source policy of your own that you already use, you already have a list of licenses that are green, red light for you, and you already know how you want people to provide information to you, then, all of this is a cakewalk, because you can just give people those policies, you can give people those guidelines, and that's what you ask them to commit to. But a lot of these provisions that I've drafted here for you that we're going to go over are for companies where the company itself is not all that sophisticated, and you can't rely on just pointing people to those guidelines or policies, because you may not just have gotten around to creating them yet. So let's go through some of this. Okay, so provision number 1. So this is going to be, I think, super familiar to all of you who have ever done any sort of professional services agreement. These very general sort of statements where you say vendor will not incorporate any third-party materials, unless specified in statement of work or company's written permission. People are totally used to seeing this in vendor agreements. This completely works for open source. And there's kind of a couple nice things about this, one of which is that, it allows you to write a very simple provision in your contract, and you don't really spend a lot of time to go, worrying about the details. And it sort of allows you to kick the can down the road, right? Like, if you have certain requirements or needs today, but at some point, what you want from your vendors becomes more sophisticated, then it allows you to change your processes, change your policies, change your expectations without changing the contract, which is really nice for a growing company. And I think that, this is not going to work for everything, right? This is great when you're hiring a vendor who's going to write very custom code for you. It's obviously not great if what you're doing is you're buying stuff that's more or less off the shelf. right? Because obviously, a vendor who has provided you something off the shelf is not going to go through a pre-approval process with you for every piece of open source or third-party code they add to their product. So context matters a lot. But I do think that in cases where you are getting very custom code, this is a great way to go, especially if you yourself don't feel very confident about open source in this entire sort of space. And it's good when you really don't expect a lot of open source. You're expecting maybe a few things. You're not expecting a lot. So, this is great. It's an old standby. This is like a great place to start. Provision number 2, prescriptive guidance. Okay, so let's say you're in a scenario where you're dealing with a really small company. It's a small shop. They clearly don't really know anything about open source law, don't have in-house counsel, don't understand most of what you've written in the contract. And in fact, they seem to be the sort of shop that will just sign anything, right? Getting really prescriptive with people about what open source compliance means and what it means to you and what your expectations is really, really helpful in that scenario, right? Because, even if this company signs up to all the warranties and indemnities in the world, it is meaningless, right? Because they're a 5-person shop. You're never going to get anything from them. And what you really want is to not have a problem in the first place. So getting prescriptive can help. And what I like about this provision is that you really covered all the basics about what you expect, right? You want the vendor to tell you all the open source they've included in the product. You want them to give you sufficient information about it. You want them to give you licenses. If you're going to put this in a product that you redistribute, you require them to give you sort of this bill of materials that you can then put into the product directly, making your life easier. Very importantly, you ask them for copies of source code for any copyleft code that they've included in their product. You've really covered all your bases. And I think this is particularly helpful because I've dealt with a lot of small companies where, you'll say to them something like, hey, give me the source code for all the copyleft code you included. And people will argue with you about whether or not that's really a requirement of open source, whether or not they really need to do that. They'll say no one has asked for that before. And by putting something like this in there, up front, you just point them to the contract. You don't have to have that argument about what open source compliance means. You're like, hey, you guys agree to do this, you're going to do this. And they eventually don't. So I think this sort of language is really helpful for small shops and where you really want to level set about your expectations. And it's a really good conversation starter, right? Because if the other company is like, oh, we have no idea how to give you this information, but you are going to put this into your main product, that's a red flag to you that maybe this company is way too unsophisticated for you to work with. Right? Because if they don't even understand the basics of what you're asking them here, then you also can't trust that they, won't put in commercial code that they don't have a license for, or that they don't have an OEM license for, things along those lines. Again, you don't need to be this prescriptive if you have developed, good guidelines and policies around how you want open source attribution to be done by vendors, how you yourself do it. But this sort of language is useful if you yourself are not that sophisticated and you need something to work with in the absence of all that other paperwork. Provision number 3, license-specific prohibitions by list. Okay, so what does this mean? So there are obviously, we talked about before that one of the main reasons why you would include open source specific provisions is because you're licensing code that's going to go into products or services that you then turn around and offer to your own customers. And if you do that, the licenses that you get inbound, right, have to be compatible with your outbound license. So an example of this is, let's say you have a mobile app that you're asking a vendor to help you develop. In that case, for example, if it's an iOS mobile app, you probably don't want GPL in it. In fact, you probably don't want LGPL in it. And so you're trying to figure out a way to say, hey, please only give us the very simple permissive licenses like MIT, BSD. Please don't give us anything that requires us to disclose the source code because, that doesn't work for this particular product, or it doesn't work for the way that we distribute it, etc. So Blue Oak Council has some suggested language. If you're not familiar with Blue Oak Council, I recommend you take a look at their website. I'm a member of Blue Oak Council, and it is a group of attorneys who are trying to put out a lot of legal materials for free to small companies to sort of help them do the basics of open source well, and kind of get them, give them resources they need while they are still small and can't really necessarily afford large counsel. So this provision comes from Blue Oak Council, and it's an example of license-specific prohibitions by list. And so what they've done here is they've categorized, dozens and dozens of licenses, and they've put some into the permissively licensed bucket. And this is an example of a provision where you say, hey, please only give us things on the permissively licensed bucket list that Blue Oak Council has. And obviously, if you have some other list that you want to work from, you could put that in instead. But this is a very basic example of that. One thing I like about this is that, if you yourself are not particularly sophisticated, it's very easy to say, hey, please just give us the permissively licensed software. We really just don't want to get into the details of any copyleft stuff. Like, we don't understand it. We don't have the capacity to look at it. Let's keep it simple, make it easy on us. I think, this is a really good approach if that's like where you are. There's, you could also do this differently, right? Instead of giving people an entire list of licenses that you do and don't accept, you could provide a definition of the type of licenses that you do and don't accept. There's upsides and downsides to doing this. I think the big downside is that if you particularly when you're dealing with some vendors that are small, a definition, for example, of what a copyleft license is going to be fairly meaningless to them and not particularly useful, right? So you may ask for it, but if they don't understand what you're asking for, it doesn't get you very far. I think giving people lists is still more useful than doing something like this if you're dealing with a small company that doesn't know what they're doing. But I think if you're dealing with a more sophisticated company and they do sort of understand, some basics of open source, they at least understand enough about, what is copyleft versus permissive. This is going to be a great way to go about it. And yeah, this is a good way. I think the only thing I would say is that this is a little bit this attempts to simplify a lot, right? Because if you're asking for somebody to write your code for your website or something like that, or an iOS app, this is going to be fairly easy for people to comply with. But if, for example, you're getting code that's going to be related to the Eclipse ecosystem, the Mozilla ecosystem, or you're going to get a Docker container, or you're going to get an image with Linux on it, then this is not that useful, right? Because ahead of time you're receiving copyleft. So not that useful for those scenarios, but useful for other scenarios where what you're getting is simpler. Okay. Provision 5, license specific. Okay, so strong copyleft ban. Okay, so the last slide we looked at gave you sort of copyleft language, which was hey, don't give me anything that requires that when I redistribute the code, I also redistribute the source code. And so it was very blanket, right? Because it included CDDL, Eclipse public license, Mozilla. But like I said in the last slide, in practice, a lot of the times, you're going to get some copyleft code. You need to get copyleft code because that's what you're asking for. But you may still draw a line between weak copyleft licenses like Mozilla, CDDL, Eclipse, and then sort of what would be termed strong copyleft license like the GPL. And the reason for that is that the weak copyleft licenses require that you provide the source code to those packages, but they're not viral, right? They don't require you to provide the source code to all derivative works of that package. So they won't affect, if you have a commercial product, you can include weak copyleft in it so long as you provide source code. It's not that hard to comply with. But if you have a commercial product, you probably shouldn't include strong copyleft in your product. Obviously, very dependent on how you license, what you're licensing, how you're distributing, etc. But if you do need to draw this line between strong copyleft, weak copyleft, this is a good provision that allows you to do that. Outside of this is, if you're working with another lawyer on the other side, I think this is like really pretty easy to understand, even for people who don't really understand open source. But again, downside is if you're not providing people very specific lists of what to give you and not to give you, and they're unsophisticated, I think this is still fairly impenetrable to them. Again, I would say that this also would need to get tweaked if you are receiving a copy of Linux, for example. But again, this is a useful starting place for a lot of folks, and this is language that is, some version of this language is really quite commonly used among more sophisticated companies that are licensing vendor software, because the more sophisticated companies, they recognize that they themselves use weak copyleft, like they have some processes for complying with the source code provision requirements. So this is pretty normal, and sometimes if you offer something where you tell people, oh, I only want permissive licenses, they might come back to you and say, well, that's really not something we can do, and they might counteroffer or something like this. So thank you. I think we still have a couple more minutes. If people have questions, I would love to take them. Please feel free to either chat them or turn on your microphone and ask. I would love to get them, and you can also contact me separately if you like.
It looks like a bunch of folks are typing, so I think we're going to get stuff in the chat. Thanks, folks might be typing some long ones. Exciting.
Okay, so Jeff asks, what's your advice on helping vendors cure their problems when found? How much time to let them fix, concrete guidance, etc.? So there's a couple ways you can do this, right? So if you have, acceptance provisions in your agreement, then like acceptance for deliverables, then this will go under that same process. And in fact, like if you weren't necessarily interested in doing an acceptance process before, you sort of trusted that they would get the code right and you'd work it out, or it's just a little bit more informal, you might consider doing it specifically for open source so that you have time to review what people are putting into the product and time to tell them, hey, this is like not what we agreed on, please take this out. So that's what I would use. I would piggyback off of that process, or I would introduce that process. Okay. Aaron Smith writes, Kate, do you have any thoughts on the imminent SBOM requirements for Biden's cybersecurity executive order, which would mandate the production of an SBOM for software sold to the U.S. federal government? For inbound licensed software that will be incorporated into products and services, I wonder how full SBOM will be met. Yeah, so the reason I was sort of excited about giving this presentation is because I do think that, that executive order makes it all the more salient. I think for companies that have already been kind of doing very nice open source hygiene, they've already been including more or less something like an SBOM in their products with respect to the open source that they use. I think the really big change is that, you should now consider also disclosing, the third-party code that you license commercially. And that may include free commercial things, but things that aren't under open source licenses per se, and under licenses that as an obligation of the license require attribution to the authors of that package. So, for larger companies, that have already been disclosing with the open source in their products. I don't really think this changes much for them. I think they have to add in the commercial stuff, but it's not going to be a wildly different process or a wildly different beast, and it shouldn't be a lot of extra work. Except I think that, there are certain cases where, that relationship between the vendor and the company might be fairly sensitive. You might actually have confidentiality requirements in your agreements that prevent you from complying with the executive order. You might want to go back and look to make sure that you can actually, the contract allows you to comply with the executive order. I think if you need to do an amendment for that, that really shouldn't be an issue, since people know that it's an executive order that's out there. But that's the one sort of pitfall I would look at. The other one is, I think it's a little bit of a security issue, right? Because some of the commercial software might be quite sensitive, might be something you even consider trade secret, and might also point to like security vulnerabilities for what's in your code. So it's a good time to sort of reassess, like, what is the information we're providing? What is the level of detail we're providing about it? I've seen some people, for example, who will disclose that, we use commercial package X, but unlike for open source, they won't disclose the version precisely because they don't worried about security vulnerabilities. So that's one thing to consider. But I do think that
we kind of have to wrap it up. But if you want to stay around and answer questions in the chat, I think that would be amazing. And I want to thank you for coming and talk to us about OSS and procurement today. So
sure. Thank you all for having me. Yeah, I'll stick around in the chat for a couple more minutes.